The night my ex-boyfriend's mother locked her bedroom door and whispered, "Stay one more hour," I finally understood what she had been trying to tell me for 2 years. Some women don't ask you to stay because they want something from you. They ask because they need a witness. And by the time Eleanor Whitaker turned that brass deadbolt with her son's name still hanging in the air between us like smoke from a fire she had lit on purpose, she had been waiting for a witness longer than anyone in that family knew. My name is Claire Holloway. I'm 31. I'm a forensic accountant in Charleston, South Carolina, which is a polite way of saying I get paid to look at numbers other people don't want me to see. 6 months before I drove out to the Whitaker house on Trad Street with a fold-up cardboard box in my trunk and absolutely no intention of staying past sundown, I had walked away from Eleanor's son Brandon, certain I would never sit at her dinner table again. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. But the most wrong I had ever been was about Eleanor herself, because that night, with the door locked and the clock counting down and her hand resting flat against the closet panel like she was steadying it from inside her own chest, I finally saw the woman who had been hiding in plain sight my entire relationship with her son. She had survived him longer than I had. She had been gathering evidence the whole time. And she had been waiting for someone strong enough and angry enough and good enough with documents to help her finish what she had started a decade before I ever showed up. I should probably start where I started, which is with Brandon. I met him at a fundraiser, which is the kind of sentence that already tells you what kind of man he was. Charleston has a particular flavor of money, the kind that goes back 5 generations and still pretends to work for a living. Brandon Whitaker was the heir to a real estate development firm his great-grandfather had built into a small empire of strip malls and waterfront condos. He didn't run the company. His mother technically did, since his father had died 2 years earlier of a stroke that none of us in his orbit really believed. But Brandon sat on the board, drew a salary, and spent most of his time at the country club explaining to other men's wives that he was very busy. The first time I saw him, he was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confident half-smile that men who have never been told no tend to develop sometime around age 14. He bought my drink before I asked for one. He laughed at my joke before I had finished telling it. He asked for my number before we had spoken about anything that mattered, and I gave it to him. I want to be honest about that. I gave him my number because I was 30 years old, tired of dating men who couldn't commit to a Friday night, and Brandon Whitaker looked like a man who had committed to everything in his life since the day he was born. What I didn't understand yet was that committed and controlled can look identical from across a candle-lit room. The first 6 months were the version of him he wanted me to see. He brought me flowers from the florist on King Street, the kind that came wrapped in brown paper with a hand-tied ribbon. He took me to the kind of restaurants where the waiter knew his name. He introduced me to his friends, who were all variations of him in slightly different suits. He told me he had been waiting his whole life for a woman who actually had a career, who could hold a conversation about something other than tennis, who didn't need anything from him. I remember that last part because it sounded like a compliment when he said it. It wasn't. It was a recruitment pitch. He was telling me what role I was being hired for. He needed a woman who could pass for independent, because then no one would ever ask why she stopped doing certain things on her own. The first red flag came on a Tuesday in October. I had a client meeting that ran late, and I texted him to say I'd meet him at the restaurant directly instead of letting him pick me up. He didn't respond. When I got to the restaurant 40 minutes later, he was sitting at the bar with a glass of bourbon, and he didn't look at me when I sat down. He just said very quietly, "I don't like surprises." I laughed because I thought he was joking, and then I saw his face, and I realized he wasn't. He waited until I had ordered a drink before he spoke again. He said it had been embarrassing for him to sit there alone, that the staff knew him, that the maitre d' had asked twice if I was coming. He said he understood work was important to me, but that, next time, I should call ahead. He used the word embarrassing 3 times in 2 minutes, and by the end of it, I was the one apologizing. I remember thinking, on the drive home that night, that I had never apologized to a man for being 40 minutes late to a dinner he hadn't asked me to come to. But I did it anyway, and that was the first crack. After that, the cracks got smaller and more frequent, until the wall was nothing but cracks, and I couldn't tell which one had let the cold in first. He started paying for everything, which sounded generous until I noticed I had stopped offering. He started suggesting which clothes looked best on me, which sounded thoughtful until I noticed my own opinions about my own body had quietly disappeared. He bought me a car for my 30th birthday, a sleek silver thing with a leather interior I didn't ask for, and when I tried to thank him properly, he waved it off and said the title was in his name for tax reasons. I didn't know enough about tax reasons then to argue. I know now. There are no tax reasons that require putting someone else's birthday gift in your own name. There are only control reasons. The money started about 8 months in. He told me his accountant had recommended consolidating some accounts to take advantage of a credit promotion and asked if I would mind opening a joint card with him in my name as the primary holder. He said it was so the points would go to me. He said he'd pay it off every month. He said it was a small favor, the kind couples did for each other when they were serious. I opened the card. I want to say I knew, but I didn't know, not really. I trusted him because I had decided to trust him, and there is a particular kind of stupidity that comes with that decision, where you keep choosing to believe the man you have already chosen to believe, because admitting you were wrong about him means admitting you have been wrong about yourself for months. Within 4 months, that card had a balance of $18,000 on it, all in charges I had never made. When I asked him about it, he said he had been planning to surprise me with a vacation and the deposits had hit early. When I asked him to pay it down, he said of course the next paycheck. The next paycheck never came. By the time I left him, that card was at $26,000, and there were 3 more like it, all in my name, all carrying balances that did not belong to me. That's the thing about financial abuse. It doesn't look like a black eye. It doesn't make anyone gasp at dinner parties. It looks like a polite, well-dressed man and a woman who can't quite figure out where her money went, and a credit score that drops 100 points in a year for no reason anyone outside her bedroom would understand. There was a moment, about 14 months in, that I think about a lot now. We were at a Saturday lunch at the yacht club, the kind of meal where every table was someone Brandon knew and every conversation was performed for the next table over. I had been talking to a woman named Sarah, a tax attorney I had liked immediately, and the two of us had ended up in a corner of the patio comparing client horror stories the way professional women do when they meet each other in rooms full of people who are not them. Brandon came over after about 20 minutes. He put his hand very lightly on the back of my neck. He smiled at Sarah and said, "I hope you're not stealing her." Sarah laughed politely and went back to her husband. Brandon walked me back to our table with his hand still on my neck, and when we sat down, he said very quietly into my ear, "You don't need to make new friends. You have me." He said it the way another man might say, "I love you." I think, in his way, he meant it as the same thing. I did not speak to Sarah again. I want to say I made that decision. I didn't. The next time she emailed me about lunch, I had already been trained not to answer, and I deleted the email before I had finished reading it, and I did not even notice I was doing it. That is what 14 months in a room with Brandon Whitaker had done to a woman who used to consider herself difficult to push around. Eleanor knew. I think I knew that she knew, even then, but I wouldn't let myself follow that thought to the place it was trying to take me. I had met Eleanor 3 weeks after I started dating Brandon at a Sunday lunch at the house on Trad Street. She was 64 then, tall, slim, with silver hair that she wore in a loose twist at the back of her head and reading glasses that were always either on her face or on the wrong table in another room. She had been a high school English teacher before she married Brandon's father and gave that up to raise 3 children and run a household that ran on appearances. She had hands that were always doing something. She knit. She gardened. She wrote thank you notes for things people had given her years ago. I liked her the first time we met, and not in the polite way you like the mother of the man you're dating because you have to. I liked her the way you like someone whose intelligence you recognize as the same shape as your own, even when neither of you is allowed to show it. She was careful around Brandon. I noticed that the first afternoon, the way I would have noticed an animal noticing a hunter. She didn't shrink. She didn't flinch. But she made decisions about when to speak and about what, and her eyes did most of the work that her mouth wasn't allowed to do. When Brandon poured his own wine and didn't offer her any, she didn't say anything. When he interrupted her in the middle of a sentence about a book she had been reading, she let him, and her hands kept moving on the napkin in her lap, like she was writing the rest of the sentence into the cloth. When he made a joke about her late husband that was a little too sharp, she lifted her glass and looked at me, just for a second, with the most tired, knowing look I had ever seen on another woman's face. I held that look. I held it for as long as she would let me. Then she turned back to her son and smiled at him like nothing had happened, and the lunch went on. I tried to ask Brandon about her later, in the car. I asked him gently, the way you ask about someone you don't yet have the right to ask about. I said, "Your mom seems sad." He laughed. He said she had always been like that, dramatic, attention-seeking, that she had never really recovered from his father's death, that she made everything about herself. He said it with so much certainty that I almost believed him. The thing about being lied to by someone you love is that it doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like information you are slowly being allowed to access about a world you didn't fully understand before. It was only later, much later, after the breakup, and after the calls stopped, and after I had had time to put what I had seen next to what I had been told, that I realized Brandon had been describing his mother the same way he would later describe me. Dramatic, attention-seeking, never recovered from something. It was the same playbook. He just hadn't gotten to my chapter yet. The breakup happened in March. There was no single moment. There rarely is with men like Brandon. There was just a Saturday morning when I woke up and looked at him sleeping next to me and realized I had not laughed, really laughed, in 11 weeks. I had a job that paid me well. I had friends who used to call me. I had a body I used to recognize in the mirror. All of those things were still technically true, but they had been hollowed out one by one, and what was left was a woman who did everything she had always done and felt nothing while she did it. That morning I got dressed, went into the kitchen, and started a kettle. When he came down 20 minutes later, I said very calmly, "I'm leaving." He laughed. He thought I meant for brunch. I said, "No, I'm leaving you." He stopped laughing. The next 2 hours were the worst of my life up to that point, because Brandon Whitaker did not handle being told no. He went through every script in order. Disbelief, then charm, then anger, then sadness, then threats, then charm again, like a man cycling through radio stations looking for one that would play the song he wanted. None of them worked. By noon, I had 2 suitcases by the front door, and Brandon was standing in the foyer, in his bathrobe, holding my car keys in his hand. He said, "You can leave. The car stays." I looked at him. I looked at the keys. Then I walked past him out the front door, and I walked the half-mile down East Bay Street in the rain, to the corner where there was a cab stand outside one of the hotels. The doorman looked at me and at my 2 suitcases and asked no questions. He waved me a cab. I came back 2 hours later with my friend Maya and her pickup truck and a copy of my own car title in my hand, the one I had quietly photographed off Brandon's desk 3 months earlier, when I had still been telling myself I was being paranoid. I drove my own car out of his driveway that afternoon, and Brandon stood in his bathrobe shouting things at me that I would think about for months afterward. He shouted about the cards, which he said were his, although they were not. He shouted that no one else would ever want me. And then, when that did not make me stop, he shouted that I would be back, because women like me always came back. The neighbor across the street was watering her hydrangeas. She did not look up. People in that neighborhood had long ago developed the skill of not looking up at the things they did not want to see. I drove off, and I did not look back, and I did not see Eleanor watching from the upstairs window. I learned later that she had been watching. The 6 months that followed were a kind of healing I would not wish on anyone, but would not give back either. I moved into a small apartment on Cannon Street. I told my partners at the firm what had happened, the careful accountant version of it, and they were kinder than I had expected. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in financial coercion, which is a phrase I had not known existed before I needed it. I worked on the debts. I worked on the credit score. I worked on the woman in the mirror who had started looking back at me again like she remembered who she had been. I lost weight, then put it back on, then stopped tracking either. I went to my mother's house in Mount Pleasant on Sunday afternoons and let her make me lunch and ask me nothing. I read books that had nothing to do with anything. I started running again, badly. I started laughing at small things again, surprised every time by the sound of my own laugh. Brandon called for the first 2 months. Then he stopped. I assumed he had moved on, which is the kind of thing you tell yourself about men like Brandon, because the alternative is that they have not moved on, they have just gotten quieter, and quieter is worse. Eleanor never called. I thought about her sometimes, especially on Sundays. I thought about that look she had given me across the dining room table, the tired, knowing look. I wondered if she had been disappointed in me for leaving, or relieved, or both. I wondered if she had a friend, anyone at all, she could talk to about her son. I wondered, in my weaker moments, if I had been a coward for leaving her there with him. I always pushed that thought away when it came, because there is no good answer to it. You cannot rescue another woman from her own son. That is not how the world works. You can only get yourself out and hope she finds her own way to the door. She called me on a Tuesday in October, 6 months almost to the day after I had left. I was at my desk eating a sandwich when my phone rang, and I saw her name on the screen, and my hand stopped in the air halfway to my mouth. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Claire," she said, and her voice was the same voice I remembered, low and warm and very careful. "I hope this isn't an awful moment." "It's fine," I said. "I'm in the middle of lunch. Eleanor, is everything?" "Everything's fine," she said, quickly. "I'm not calling because something's wrong. I'm calling because I have a small favor to ask." I waited. She waited. The silence stretched out the way silence does when 2 careful women are trying to figure out who's going to make the first move. "I've been doing some clearing out," she said, "of Brandon's old room. He's been talking about renovating, and I told him I'd box up the things he hasn't touched in years. There are some of your things still in his closet. A jacket, I think. Some books. A box you packed and never came back for. I'd like to give them back to you if you'd come by." "Eleanor," I said carefully, "I don't really want to be in the same house as Brandon right now." "He won't be here," she said. "He's at the club this Friday, from 1 until 5. A golf tournament. He won't come back until at least 6. If you came at 2, you'd have plenty of time." I almost said no. I should say that. I almost said no, because the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing my therapist would have told me to do was to tell Eleanor that whatever was in that closet wasn't worth seeing the inside of that house again. But there was something in her voice that wasn't asking about a jacket. There was something underneath the words that I couldn't name yet, but that I had heard once before, that Sunday at the dining table, when she had looked at me over the rim of her wine glass with that tired, knowing look. The look that said, "Please." "Friday at 2, I said. "I'll bring a box." "Thank you, Claire," she said, and then, just before she hung up, very softly, "Bring something to carry papers in. The jacket is heavier than you think." The line went dead. I sat at my desk for a long time with my sandwich in my hand, and I felt the kind of cold start somewhere in my stomach that you feel when you realize the conversation you just had was not the conversation you were having. Bring something to carry papers in. The jacket is heavier than you think. I am a forensic accountant. I notice when a sentence is doing two things at once. I called my paralegal at home that night and asked her to bring me, on Friday morning, a portable scanner, a fresh thumb drive, and the largest neutral-looking tote bag we had at the office. I told her I was running an errand for a friend. She didn't ask. That's why she's my paralegal. Friday came. I drove out to Trad Street at 1:45 in a navy blouse and jeans, with a fold-up cardboard box and a canvas tote that did not look like it was going to do anything more interesting than carry a jacket. The Whitaker house sat back from the street, the way old Charleston houses do, half hidden behind a wrought iron gate and a magnolia that had been there longer than any of us. The driveway was empty except for Eleanor's Cadillac, an older one, the kind of dark green that you only saw on cars, that had been bought before the year 2000 and lovingly kept since. I parked behind it. I sat in my car for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and I looked at the house, and I told myself, very clearly, that I could leave at any time. Then I got out. Eleanor opened the door before I had finished climbing the porch steps. She was in a soft gray cardigan and slacks, with the same loose silver twist and the same reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she looked older than I remembered, not in years, in something else. "Claire," she said, and her hands took mine in a way that her voice on the phone hadn't prepared me for. She held them for a long second, and her thumbs pressed once against the backs of my knuckles, the way you might squeeze the hand of someone you were trying to tell something to without saying it. "Eleanor," I said, "come in. Quickly. Please." I came in. She shut the door behind me, and I heard the deadbolt turn. And that was the first time my stomach did the thing that stomachs do when your body knows something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. The house was the same, and not the same. The hall was darker than I remembered. The grandfather clock at the foot of the stairs was still keeping the same steady time it had been keeping the first afternoon I came here for lunch. There were fresh white lilies in the entry, which was strange, because Eleanor did not like white lilies. She had told me so once. She had said they smelled like funerals. The lilies were there anyway. I noticed all of this in the first 10 seconds. Because I am someone who notices, and because there was something off in the air of that house that I could not name but could feel against my skin. "Brandon is at the club," she said. "He left at 12:30. He'll be back at 6, maybe a little before. I gave Maria the afternoon off. There's no one else in the house." "Eleanor." "Upstairs," she said, already moving. "Please, we don't have a lot of time." I followed her. The stairs creaked the way they always had. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else I couldn't quite place, a paper and ink smell, like an old book that had been left open. She walked ahead of me with her hand on the banister, and I noticed, because I notice these things, that her shoulders were higher than they should have been, that her breathing was a beat too fast, that she was a woman holding something together by force. Brandon's old bedroom was at the end of the hall. The door was closed. She opened it, and the smell of paper got stronger. It was the room I remembered. The bed was made. The blinds were half drawn. The blue rug was the same blue rug. The bookshelf along the wall still had the rowing trophies and the framed photo of him at the country club at 16 and the books he had never read, because Brandon Whitaker did not read books. He had them. There was a fold-up cardboard box on the bed, which I supposed was meant to look like the reason I had come. The closet was open. It was not the closet I remembered. The closet I remembered had been a man's closet, half full, with the kind of expensive nothing that wealthy men accumulate when they don't really have a sense of who they are. This closet was almost empty. The hangers had been pushed to one side. The shoes were gone. The shelves had been cleared. And at the back, where the closet went into the wall and turned to the left in the way that old Charleston closets do, There was a panel of wallpapered drywall that was not flush with the wall behind it. It was sitting slightly forward, as if someone had been working it loose and had not finished putting it back. Eleanor walked to the closet. She stepped inside. She turned and looked at me, and her face was different in there, in the closed-in dim of that closet, than it had been downstairs. "Claire," she said, "I need to show you something. And before I do, I need you to know that you can leave at any time. You can walk out of this house right now and never speak to me again, and I will understand, and there will be no hard feelings. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "I'm serious, Claire. What I'm about to show you is going to make it very difficult to leave. I know that. I know I am about to make your life more complicated. If you want to go, go now." I looked at her. I looked at the panel behind her, the one that wasn't flush. I looked at the empty closet, and the empty room, and the empty house, and the careful, careful woman in the gray cardigan who was offering me a door I could still walk through. "I'm staying," I said. She closed her eyes for a half-second. Her shoulders dropped. I saw, in that small movement, what it had cost her to offer me the out. Then she opened her eyes, walked past me back to the bedroom door, and I heard the small, definite click of a lock. She turned around. Her hand was still on the doorknob. "Stay 1 more hour," she said, almost a whisper, almost a prayer. "That's all I'm asking. 1 hour." For a moment we just looked at each other across that room. The light through the half-drawn blinds was the color of old paper. The grandfather clock downstairs struck 2. Eleanor's hand left the doorknob. "Come here, Claire," she said. "I want to show you what I have been doing for the last 2 years." I went to her. She walked back into the closet, and I followed her, and she put her fingers against the loose panel and slid it sideways. It moved easily, the way a panel moves when someone has been moving it for a long time. Behind it was a space about 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, set into the dead space between the closet and the bathroom on the other side of the wall. It was not a hidden room. It was not a vault. It was a cavity. The kind of cavity that exists in every old house, the kind that no one notices and no one uses, until someone does. And what was in this one made my stomach do the thing again. There were file boxes, 6 of them stacked 2 by 3, each one labeled in Eleanor's neat school-teacher cursive. There were 3 external hard drives in a plastic case. There was a manila envelope on top of the boxes with my name on it in the same careful hand. There was a small leather jewelry case, the kind grandmothers in Charleston kept brooches in. There was a stack of bank statements held together with a green rubber band. There was a photo album. There was a digital voice recorder. And there was, sitting on top of all of it, like a flag planted on a country, a single white envelope addressed to Eleanor Whitaker from a law firm in Atlanta, whose name I recognized because every forensic accountant in the South recognizes that name. They handle federal investigations. "Eleanor," I said. "I have been documenting my son," she said quietly, "since the week his father died." I sat down on the floor of the closet. I had to. My knees did it before I gave them permission. Eleanor sat down next to me, slowly, the way a woman her age sits down on a floor when she has decided that the floor is where the conversation needs to happen. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at me for a long moment. "Brandon killed his father," she said. "Not with his hands. I don't mean that. I mean that he had been stealing from him for 3 years, and when Howard found out, he had a stroke in his office on a Wednesday afternoon while he was reading the bank statements, and he died at the hospital 2 days later without ever waking up. Brandon was in the room when he had the stroke. He has told the family for 10 years that he was at the country club. He was not at the country club. He was sitting across the desk from his father, and he was telling him things, and Howard's heart could not carry the weight of what he was being told. I know this because I have a recording. Howard had a small recorder in his desk drawer. He used it to dictate notes between meetings. It was on that afternoon. I found it 3 days after the funeral. I have listened to it once. I will not listen to it again. It is on one of those drives. I could not speak. I could not move. I sat on that closet floor and I looked at this woman, this careful, gray-cardiganed, 66-year-old woman, and I understood that I had spent the last 3 years underestimating her so completely that I should not be allowed to call myself a professional. After Howard died, she continued, I didn't know what to do. I was 64. I had no money in my own name. The company was structured so that everything went into a trust that Brandon controlled, and the trust paid me a monthly allowance, and I had no access to any of it without his signature. I knew what he had done. I had heard it, but I had no proof I could use. The recording on its own is not enough, not legally. So I started watching. I started writing things down. I started saving things. Every bank statement that came to this house, every receipt that fell out of his pocket, every email he printed and threw away, every voicemail he left me that contradicted the next voicemail he left me. I have 10 years of it, Claire. 10 years. She gestured at the boxes. Her hand was shaking, just a little. Then he met you, she said, and I watched him do to you what he had been doing to me for a decade. The cards, the cars, the accounts, the slow, patient cutting of you off from the parts of yourself you needed to leave him. I watched it, and I could not say anything to you, because if I had warned you, he would have known, and what I have been doing here in this closet would have ended. I had to choose, Claire. I had to choose between warning you and finishing this. I chose to finish this. I have not stopped being sorry for that. I will not stop being sorry for that for the rest of my life. Eleanor, I said. My voice did not sound like mine. Let me finish, please, because we have less than 3 hours, and there is still a lot I need you to know. When you left him, I thought you might come back. They always come back in the beginning. When you didn't come back, I started thinking about what to do next. The letter on top of those boxes is from a law firm in Atlanta. I contacted them 4 months ago through a friend. They specialize in elder financial abuse and federal securities fraud. They have agreed to take my case. They have told me that what I have is enough to begin, but that it would be much, much stronger with the help of a forensic accountant who can take the documents I have and structure them into a record that the federal authorities will accept as a starting point. They told me to find one. They told me to find one I could trust completely, because the person I chose would, by the time we were finished, know more about my family than any human being alive. She looked at me. I called you, Claire, because I could not think of anyone else I would rather have see all of this, and because, if I am being honest, I owe you. I let him do to you what he did to you. I let him do it, and I watched, and I did nothing. The only thing I can do now is hand you the only thing in my life that I have ever built without him touching it. And I am asking, Claire, with everything I have, please, help me end him. The grandfather clock downstairs struck the quarter hour. 2:15. I sat on that closet floor for what was probably 10 seconds and what felt like a year. I thought about a lot of things in those 10 seconds. I thought about the $18,000 on the card. I thought about my mother's face when I had told her 6 months ago that I needed to come home for a while. I thought about the silver Cadillac in the driveway, and the lilies in the hall, and the woman in the gray cardigan who had been carrying this alone for a decade because there had been no one else in her life she could carry it with. I thought about Brandon at the country club, swinging a club at a small white ball, smiling at men who would have done what he did if they had been smart enough. Then I stood up. I dusted my hands off on my jeans. I walked out of the closet, picked up my canvas tote, and brought it back in. I unzipped it. I took out the scanner, the laptop, the thumb drive, and the 4 legal pads I had brought, and I set them on the floor of the closet next to the boxes, because the closet was the safest place in the house, and we were not going to move any of this further than we had to. "Eleanor," I said, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you to do, in the order I tell you to do it. I need to know how long that recording is. I need the password for that hard drive. And I need you to bring me a glass of water, because I'm about to work very fast and I'm going to forget to breathe." Her face did something I had never seen it do before. It did not smile exactly. It did something better. It loosened, the way a face loosens when a woman who has been holding her breath for 10 years finally lets it out. "Yes," she said. "Yes. All right." She left the closet. She came back a minute later with a glass of water and the password written on an index card in her cursive. She knelt down across from me. She opened the first box. We did not speak much for the next 40 minutes. There was not time. I started with the bank statements because bank statements are the spine of any financial fraud case and everything else hangs off them. Eleanor had organized them by month, which I had not expected. She had also flagged in red ink in the margin of each statement the line items she believed were unauthorized withdrawals from the family trust. She had been doing this for 10 years. The red ink in some of the older statements had faded to pink. I started scanning, 2 pages at a time, and the scanner was slow because it was a small one, and the paper was old, and I had to coach Eleanor through the file naming, because the documents had to be named in a specific format if any of this was going to be useful to the law firm later. The first thing I noticed, 10 minutes in, was the pattern. Eleanor had not just flagged the withdrawals, she had grouped them. There were 4 categories, color-coded in the margin in pencil so faint I almost missed it. Cash withdrawals from the trust operating account. Wire transfers to a shell company called Magnolia Holdings, LLC, which I had never heard of and which, when I pulled it up on the Secretary of State's website on my phone, was registered to a P.O. box in Florence and listed Brandon as the sole member. Checks made out to a woman named Diana Brewster, who I would learn later that night was a girlfriend Brandon had been seeing for the last 3 years of our relationship and the first 6 months of mine. And in the 4th category, a series of recurring monthly debits to a private account in the Cayman Islands that Howard Whitaker had set up in 1998, and that, according to Eleanor's notes in the margin, Brandon had been emptying at a rate of approximately $11,000 a month since 2 months before his father's stroke. The total of just that 4th category, by my rough arithmetic on the back of a legal pad, was approaching $1.5 million. I looked at the number. I looked at Eleanor. I did not say anything. She nodded once, very slightly, the way a woman nods when she has been waiting for someone else to see the thing she has been seeing alone for a decade. While the scanner worked, I asked her questions. Quick, clean questions. How many accounts had Brandon had access to? Whose signatures had appeared on which transfers? Whether any of the transfers had gone to entities that did not exist on the company's official books. She answered everything. She had answers I would not have expected a non-accountant to have, and when I told her so, she said very quietly that she had been a high school English teacher for 22 years, and that she was very, very good at reading documents and at understanding what people were trying to hide inside their own sentences. I believed her. I have rarely believed anyone faster. At 2:45, I made her go downstairs and put a kettle on because we needed her to look like she was doing something normal if anyone came to the door, and because I needed 5 minutes alone with the photo album. The photo album was the part I had been most afraid of and most curious about. I opened it on the closet floor. It was not a photo album, not really. It was a record. Photographs of bruises on her own arms, dated in her handwriting. Photographs of broken objects in the house, dated. Photographs of bank statements pinned to the kitchen table where Brandon had thrown them in front of her. Photographs of his text messages to her, screen captured, dated, printed, and pasted into the album like a scrapbook from the wrong life. I looked at 12 pages of it. I closed the album. I sat very still on the closet floor for 30 seconds, and I did the thing my therapist had taught me to do when I felt myself about to lose hold of the work, which was to look at one fixed point in the room and count to 7, slowly, while breathing. I counted to 7, I opened the album again, I started scanning. Eleanor came back upstairs at 2:55 with 2 mugs of tea, neither of which we drank. She sat next to me. She watched the scanner. She said, after a long minute, "I'm sorry you have to see those." "Eleanor, I should have called the police, I know." "You did call the police," I said without looking up. "You're calling them now. You're just calling them through me. That's all the police ever are anyway. People with paperwork." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. She reached over and put her hand on the back of mine, briefly, and then took it back. We kept working. At 3:30, I had the bank statements and the photo album fully scanned. I started on the recordings. The voice recorder had 4 files on it. I did not listen to any of them. I did not need to. That was not what I was there to do. That was a job for the federal investigators. I copied the files to the thumb drive. I copied the contents of the 3 hard drives to my laptop, and then to a second, encrypted partition I had set up on the drive that morning. I worked the way I work when a client's company is being seized by the SEC, and we have 6 hours to extract the evidence we will need before the office is sealed, which, in a way, was what we were doing. At 4:15, I had the law firm's letter scanned, the manila envelope with my name on it scanned without reading it. Eleanor said I could read it later in my own home when there was time, and I was on the last box of receipts. At 4:30, Eleanor's phone buzzed downstairs. She went to it. She came back to the closet doorway with her face slightly tighter than it had been. "He's leaving the club," she said. "He texted that he'll be home in 40 minutes. "Okay. That's earlier than he said." "I heard you. Eleanor, breathe. We're almost done." I worked faster. I scanned the last 15 receipts in 9 minutes. I packed the scanner into the tote. I packed the laptop. I packed the thumb drive into a small velvet pouch and put it in the zippered interior pocket of the tote, the one no casual hand would find on the way to a coat hook. I left the original documents exactly where they had been, in the boxes, behind the panel, because we were not, on this trip, removing the original documents. The originals had to stay. The originals were Eleanor's life insurance. The copies were what the law firm was going to need to build a case that would not depend on whether the originals were still here when the case opened. I slid the panel closed. I pressed the seam flat. I checked with my fingernail that the wallpaper was sitting flush. It was. Eleanor watched me. She had not said anything for 10 minutes. "That box on the bed," I said. "The fold-up one. Let's put some of my old things in it. The jacket, the books, whatever's left. I need to walk out of here with something that looks like the reason I came." "Yes," she said. "Yes." She helped me. We packed quickly. There was, in fact, a jacket of mine in the hall closet downstairs, an old gray wool coat I had left there one winter and never come back for. There were 3 books on the shelf in Brandon's room that I had bought him as gifts and could legitimately claim back. There was a box of letters and small things, my own handwriting, that I had packed myself the day I left, and that Brandon had kept in his closet like a man who refused to admit he had lost. I took those, too. By the time the box was full, it looked like a sad little archaeology of 2 years I would never see again, which, in a way, it was. The grandfather clock downstairs struck 5. "You have to go," Eleanor said. "I know. He'll be here in 15 minutes, maybe 10. "I know." I picked up the box. I put the canvas tote over my shoulder. I looked at her. She looked at me. We did not hug because we were not the kind of women who hugged at the end of a thing like this, and because Eleanor would still need to be exactly as composed in 15 minutes as she had been in 15 years, and I was not going to ruin her composure on the way out the door. "Eleanor," I said. "Yes." "You did this. I want you to know that. I scanned. I packed. I'll get this to Atlanta on Monday. But you did this. 10 years of it. You did it alone, in this house, with that man under this roof. Anything that happens from this point on, it's yours. I'm just paperwork." She closed her eyes. "Go, Claire," she said softly. "Please, go." I went. The hall was dim in the late afternoon light. The lilies in the entry still smelled like funerals. The deadbolt turned under my hand, smoothly, and I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind me. The driveway was empty except for Eleanor's Cadillac. I walked, not too fast, to my car. I put the cardboard box in the back seat. I put the canvas tote on the floor of the passenger seat, where my foot could feel it for the entire drive home. I started the engine. I backed out of the driveway. I drove down Trad Street, slowly, the way you drive when you are not allowed to look like you are leaving anywhere quickly. I was 3 blocks away when I saw Brandon's car pass me coming the other way. He did not see me. I had a different car now. I watched his taillights in the rearview mirror until they turned into the driveway behind me. I made it to my apartment. I locked my door. I put the canvas tote in the middle of my kitchen table, sat down across from it, and I did the thing I had not let myself do for the last 3 hours. I cried. Not for long. Just long enough to get it out of my body so I could get back to work. Then I made coffee. Then I called the law firm in Atlanta. The senior partner answered on a Friday evening, which tells you something about what kind of case Eleanor had brought them. I told him who I was. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "how quickly can you be in Atlanta on Monday?" 8 in the morning. "That'll do." He hung up. I spent the weekend at my mother's house in Mount Pleasant with the canvas tote in the guest room and a chair pushed against the door. I did not tell my mother anything. I told her I was working on something for a client. She did not ask. On Sunday night, she made me her gumbo, and we watched an old movie I have already forgotten, and I slept the kind of sleep you sleep when you have done a thing you cannot yet talk about but know was the right thing. Monday I drove to Atlanta. I sat in a conference room with 3 lawyers and a paralegal, and a man from a federal agency whose card I am not going to describe further than that. I handed over the thumb drive. I walked them through, line by line, what was on it, in the order Eleanor had organized it, with the citations and cross-references I had built into the file structure over the weekend. They took notes. They asked clean surgical questions. By the end of the day, I had been deposed in a preliminary capacity, signed 3 non-disclosure agreements, and accepted an engagement letter as a consulting forensic expert on a matter that was, the senior partner told me, going to take 18 to 24 months to come to public light. I drove back to Charleston that night. I did not call Eleanor. We had agreed I would not. The first phase of any case like this depends on the target not knowing it has begun, and Brandon, whatever else he was not stupid. He would notice if his mother started behaving differently. So Eleanor did not behave differently. She kept making Sunday lunch. She kept losing her reading glasses. She kept letting him interrupt her at the dinner table, and her hands kept moving on the napkin in her lap, like she was writing the rest of the sentence into the cloth. For 6 months, I did not see her or speak to her. I worked in the background. The case widened. It turned out that Brandon's embezzlement of the trust had been just one branch of a much larger pattern that touched the company itself, that touched 2 minority partners who had been wondering for years where their distributions were going, and that touched the federal tax authority in a way that the federal tax authority was deeply, professionally interested in. The thing about men like Brandon is that they always do more than you think. The thing about women like Eleanor is that they always have more than you think. I went to Atlanta twice a month for those 6 months, always on Mondays, always quietly, always under the same engagement letter and the same non-disclosure agreement. I built a forensic record that, by month 4, was 840 pages long. I cross-indexed it, against 3 different state databases and 1 federal one. I sat in a windowless conference room across from a woman from the IRS who did not laugh at my jokes, but who, by the 3rd meeting, started bringing me a cup of the good coffee from the office down the hall, and I understood that this was her version of friendship and accepted it gratefully. I learned over those months the names of every shell company Brandon had used, every offshore account, every fictitious vendor he had invoiced through his own subsidiary. I learned the names of 3 other women he had been involved with during my own relationship, 2 of whom were also being paid through the company books in ways that the company books had not been told about. I did not feel jealousy about that. I felt something quieter and more useful, which was confirmation. I had not been crazy. I had not been paranoid. I had been one of 4. And the woman in the gray cardigan in Charleston had been one of all of us for the last 10 years by herself in the dark. Federal agents executed a search warrant on the Whitaker house and the company offices on a Tuesday morning in May. I read about it in the Post and Courier 2 days later, the way ordinary Charlestonians did. The article was small. The arrests were larger. Brandon was charged with 17 counts that I will not list, because they have not all been adjudicated, and because I am professionally not the person who lists them. Eleanor called me a week after the arrests. She called from a number I did not recognize. She said, "Claire, it's done." "It's begun," I said. "There's a difference." She laughed for the first time since I had known her. It was a real laugh. It was bright and warm, and a little ragged at the edges, like a woman who had not used the muscle in a while. "You sound like a lawyer," she said. "I sound like an accountant." Same thing. "It isn't, but I'll let you have it." We met for coffee 3 days later at a small place on Queen Street I had been going to since the breakup. She wore the gray cardigan. She had on a different pair of reading glasses on a different chain. She looked 10 years younger and 100 years more tired. We sat by the window. We didn't talk about the case because we were not allowed to, and because we didn't need to. We talked about her sisters. We talked about a book she had been reading. She asked me about my work, and I told her. And she listened the way she had always listened, which was completely. Before she left, she reached into her bag and took out a small leather jewelry case, the same one I had seen in the closet, and slid it across the table. "This was my mother's," she said. "She left it to me. I'd like you to have it, not because of anything you did, because you reminded me, in that closet, of what she was like. She was a woman who did things. I haven't met many." I opened the case. There was a thin gold bracelet inside, with a clasp shaped like a small knot. "Eleanor, don't argue with me, Claire. I've been argued with by a man for 40 years. I'm done." I closed the case. I put it in my bag. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you," she said. She paid for the coffee, which I let her do, and we walked out onto Queen Street, and the late spring sun was on the cobblestones, and an entire city of polite Charleston was walking by without knowing what either of us had just been through. Eleanor turned to me on the sidewalk and squeezed my hand once, the same squeeze she had given me at her door in October, and then she walked away toward King Street with her shoulders straight and her gray cardigan moving a little in the wind off the harbor. I stood there for a moment, watching her go. Then I walked back to my car. I drive past the house on Trad Street sometimes when I have a meeting on the south end of the peninsula. It's still there. Eleanor still lives in it, although the trust is now structured in her name, and the company is being unwound under the supervision of a court-appointed administrator, and the brass nameplate beside the front gate has been changed from Whitaker to her own maiden name, which is Caldwell. The magnolia is still in the front yard. The grandfather clock is still keeping the same steady time it has been keeping since before either Eleanor or I were born. I think sometimes about the closet, about the panel, about the cavity in the wall that no one but Eleanor and I and a sealed federal evidence room will ever see the inside of. I think about the woman in the gray cardigan kneeling on a closet floor at 66, with a glass of water and an index card with a password on it. finally getting to hand someone else a thing she had been carrying alone for a decade. I think about how she had not asked me to rescue her. She had not even asked me to help her. She had asked me to stay. One more hour. That was all she had asked of me, and that was all it had taken. I learned later from Eleanor herself what had happened after I left the house that afternoon. Brandon had come home at 5:40. He had been in a good mood from the country club, the kind of good mood he had when he had won something at someone else's expense. He'd come into the kitchen and found Eleanor sitting at the table with a book she was not reading and a cup of tea that had gone cold. He had asked her what she had done with the afternoon. She had said very calmly that she had finished clearing out the last of his old closet, that Claire Holloway had come by to pick up the things that were hers, and that the closet was now empty, and that he could start the renovation whenever he liked. He had stood very still at that. He had said Claire's name once, in a voice she did not like. Eleanor had looked up at him over the rim of her glasses and said, "She left a long time ago, Brandon. I don't know why you're still surprised by that." Then she had gone back to her book. He had stood in the kitchen for a long minute. Then he had walked upstairs to his old room, and Eleanor had heard the closet door open, and she had heard him moving things around inside, and she had sat at the kitchen table with her cold tea and counted, very slowly, to 100. He had come back downstairs. He had said nothing about the closet. He had poured himself a bourbon, and he had eaten the dinner she had made, and he had gone to bed at his usual time, and the panel had stayed flush against the wall the way I had pressed it, and Eleanor had lain in her own bed 2 doors down and stared at her ceiling and known, for the first time in 10 years, that the worst part of her life was no longer in front of her. It was behind her. It was already on a thumb drive in a forensic accountant's apartment in downtown Charleston, and there was nothing he could do about it that he had not already done. I think about the title my friends gave the story when I finally told them, over a long dinner, the carefully edited version I'm allowed to tell. They called it "The Night I Went Back to My Ex's House and Got Out Clean." I let them have that. It's not the right title, but it isn't the wrong one either. The right title is the one Eleanor used that afternoon in a voice almost too quiet to hear, with her hand on a brass deadbolt and her son's name still hanging in the air between us. Stay one more hour. I did, and she got her life back, and I got something I hadn't even realized I had been missing for 2 years, which is the knowledge that the woman I had thought was my enemy had been quietly, patiently, dangerously on my side the whole time, and that some of the strongest women in your life will be the ones who, when you walk away from the man who hurt you both, do not call out after you because they are not ready yet, but who will, when they are ready, call you back and ask you, very politely, to bring something to carry papers in. If you've ever had a moment where someone you underestimated turned out to be the most dangerous ally you ever had, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you've ever stayed one more hour for someone, when leaving would have been easier, tell me about that too. And if this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.